another episode of Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, Matthew Fisher, and I'm joined for a second time by Rob McMullen. He's a natural law expert and he works for the Natural Law Institute. You can follow him on Twitter or X at the McMullen. That's at the McMullen. And he's joining us today to give us some counterpoints to libertarianism from a natural law perspective. How are you, Rob?
Good, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on again.
No worries. So, as I just mentioned, we're going to be giving some counterpoints. So, fire away.
Yeah, so I listened to John's chat with John Ruddock. He's a great guy, and I think he's a strong politician, strong character. He's got good morals. So it's definitely not an adversarial thing that I wanted to do. But libertarianism is a specific philosophy, and I know that there are a lot of people who will be marginally aligned with it, but who feel a bit different. And I think in a lot of instances, what I study, which is natural law, um, fills a lot of those gaps. It gives voice to the ways in which people might feel like there's something lacking for them in libertarianism. And so I wanted to do this chat basically to just flesh out a few ideas that are counterpoints to strict libertarian theory. And if you find it interesting, if you find that it gives language to how you feel or about society and that and politics, then that's great. But it's definitely not an adversarial thing. My goal is not to trying to be competing with the libertarians. I think generally they are a great party. I'm actually a member of the party myself, and I spoke to John about this last time. I think they are worth putting your lot in with and cooperating with because they are heading in the right direction. But having said that, the things that I bring up under natural law, I think a lot of people do resonate with, even a lot of libertarians, and so that's why I do it.
And it's perfectly reasonable. I think even the libertarians themselves are open to these kind of discussions where they have a kind of not really big tent's not the right word, but they have this openness to differing ideas that you won't see in other minor right wing parties, especially something like One Nation, where it's what Pauline Hanson wants goes. So it is refreshing to have someone like Ruddock who will come onto shows like this where you have a disagreement with John and myself or with you. So I think yeah, the Libertarian Party, from everything we've seen, everything behind the scenes, it's a very good and promising sign for Australian politics.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get into it. They do have it correct that we need a system of decidability, a way for us, like a system of cooperation. They do have that correct. Um, because once again, when we look at natural law, the whole point of natural law is that if you want to violate nature's laws, well, you can't. You can stave them off for a little bit, but there's a saying, I think it was Thomas Sowell, the American economist, I think, said, "You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the effects of ignoring reality." And that's the basis of natural law: is that there are laws to nature, there are laws to human nature that if you wanted a good and moral government, they would be taking into account to maximize our returns within those, not leading some ideological cult movement that imagines that we can be free of the laws of nature and human nature as well. So that's the basis of natural law, that how we approach it anyway. That's why we call it a natural law thing, because there are natural laws that we need to take into account when designing political and legal systems. So libertarians do have it correct in the sense that they say they've got a system for human cooperation, which is important. So under natural law, one of the natural laws we refer to is entropy. Do you know what entropy means?
Yeah, when a system breaks down over time.
Absolutely. So there's a time based element and there's an escaping of energy element. So, what human beings need to do is to cooperate to get greater returns on the energy we expend so that we can further outrun entropy. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, in a very simple way, if our bodies are a very complex system, which will entropy over time if we don't eat. I hope I'm putting this in very, very simple language, which is the goal. Um, and then when we go outside us as one organism, we start dealing with lots of different people. If we can all specialize in different things, we're going to get more food, therefore have a greater store of energy, which is going to allow us to further outrun the entropic process of dying from starvation. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, it's basic division of labor stuff, economic theory, and so cooperation is what allows us to store that energy and get maximum returns on the energy we expend. Um, and so, big part of the Natural Law Institute's goal was defining cooperation. Now, the libertarians define cooperation as voluntarism. That is their number one criteria. If things are voluntary, then you're cooperating with people. And it's not so much that it's wrong, it's just a little bit low resolution. So, what we say is that the equal sign between people, the cooperation gold standard is reciprocity. I've done a show on the other side with Damien about this, talking about reciprocity. So, where the libertarians have voluntarism as one criteria, we have voluntarism as a criteria of reciprocity, but we also have others. So, we define reciprocity as voluntary, um, exhaustively informed. So, if you're trading with someone and there's an asymmetry of knowledge about what's going on, or the risk, or the hazards, or the limitations of the deal, etc., if you've got more information than the other person, if you want them to not feel ripped off after the deal, you would try your best. You try to exhaustively inform them of everything they need to know. Um, the second, another criteria would be productive. If you enter into an exchange with someone else, are the demonstrated interests of all parties going to be better off? Are you going to get an increase in value, an increase in stored energy from this, or are you trying to are you cooperating to an escape and a negative? So basically, is it a win-win? Then there's warranted. Are you warranting the effects? Are you able to restitute people for any negative effects that they have as a result of dealing with you? And is it free of external? Is it free of externality on the demonstrated interests of other people as well? So we have a whole checklist there about reciprocity. Does that all make sense?
Yep. It makes sense because it's kind of I come from an economics background, so it's kind of talking about greater optimal solutions where parties are better off, or if one party's not better off, the gains to one party can be taken and given to the other to compensate their losses.
Yeah, exactly. So what we say under natural law is that we're trying to preserve the incentives for cooperation. That's what we're trying to do, because cooperation through time is what gives us the greatest increase in value or the store of energy, whether you want to talk about it economics or like scientific framework, it doesn't really matter. But we're all best off if we preserve the incentives for cooperation. So the difference between libertarians there is when you just say voluntary, there's a little bit of wiggle room with a few things that will result in people feeling ripped off. Generally, I mean, and that's one of the reasons I go through this stuff too, is because when you talk to a lot of libertarians who are just more kind of conservative, or they don't really get into the weeds with this stuff, they think it makes intuitive sense. They go, oh, of course, well, I wouldn't do that. I know, but when you're talking about systems at scale, you really need to cover all your bases. You really need to shore up the edges of the ideology to make sure there's no wiggle room for people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are some libertarians, and we've documented these, that will say that blackmail is a voluntary exchange, therefore it's not immoral. But that's why we have the category of productive, because if somebody's entering into a blackmail agreement, they're only engaging with you to escape the imposition of a negative. They're only trying to fend off losing value. They're not increasing their value. And that's why in a high trust society, blackmail is not an acceptable way to deal with people. There's also, in terms of the exhaustively informed and warranted, libertarians may have different opinions on this, but in our current society, I think this is the problem that a lot of uni students are falling into with crippling education debt. Is they're not really being fully informed, or they're being traded with at a level that's above their maturity and agency and life experience. So they're essentially being baited into a situation which is good for the universities. And then when they demand redistribution to cover the cost of their education, it's good for the government. But the people who are being left behind in that situation is the young people saddled with unmanageable debt. So I hope you can see that with that larger criteria of reciprocity, we do get into a lot more detail than just saying it's voluntary. It's voluntary. Another thing is not everybody has the same amount of agency or maturity, whether that's cognitive or emotional. And so a purely voluntary situation can take advantage of people who have less agency. And that's what we call baiting into hazard. So this is another big difference, I think, between libertarianism and natural law, because what we've done is encode Western natural law. We can explain European high trust ethics, whereas libertarianism, you can kind of split libertarianism into like an Anglo libertarianism and then more of like I guess, more a non Anglo libertarianism, if you know what I mean. And the definition, so the dividing line comes down to is something's a high trust ethic or not. So what I'm talking about is if somebody's gambling, have they just mortgaged their house because they've got an addiction for gambling? And are their kids going to suffer because they've got an addiction for gambling? So if you are not, if you've got more of like a low trust society where you don't see people as your in group, if somebody wants to come and spend their life savings in your casino, you don't care. You just say, well, it's voluntary. You made your own choice. Whereas with reciprocity and Western high trust ethics, we say you may gamble, but if it actually gets to the point where you're damaging, there's externalities, you're damaging your family, you're damaging yourself long term. If you're demonstrating a lack of agency, then it's actually immoral to keep trading with that person without some kind of intervention. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
I wonder what a libertarian would say in that situation. But really, the dividing line there comes down to whether you see people as your in group or not. Do you see when someone else damages themselves, does that have nothing to do with you, or is it maybe even beneficial to you? Or is that damaging to you because this person is your in group? So there's a low trust and high trust ethics thing going on there. Um, I'm just having a look through my list. Do you
It's
have
all
any
good.
questions about
I
that so
think,
far?
yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up this libertarianism comes from more of an Anglo strain. Natural law comes from more of a continental European strain of thought, and you see more broadly when it comes to uh, conservatism, more generally politically, or you talk about economic systems, you see a much more individualistic strain, and from the British Isles where you have like David Ricardo or Adam Smith, and there's this very individualistic view to economics, whereas you compare it to the German economists, and it's much more of a collective system where there's
Absolutely.
more of a thought given to externalities or impacts on of consumption on the broader society. And it's interesting to see all these similarities pop up in different aspects, where it's economics, politics, political theory, or sociology, or even talking about what we are talking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't going to say it, but I will say it to make the point. I think you can split. So, so landlocked peoples tend to evolve to be more tribal because you have to, whereas the benefit that the British Isles have is the natural barrier of the Channel, allowing them to sort of be more individualistic, if you know what I mean. They didn't have to tribalize because they're not a landlocked people. So the British definitely have an individualist strain there as well. But even so, I tend to, in my mind, split libertarianism specifically from more of like an Anglo classical liberalism to more of like a Jewish libertarianism, which is more along the lines of, okay, well, we've got our own tribe, so if you trade with us to your own detriment, it's got nothing to do with me. And you can only get away with that if you live within a high trust society. But it's consumptive of that high trust society. So you're actually using the high trust society to conduct business that is low trust. So that's immoral, and it's a consumption of energy. It's not an add to the end. It's not productive. So we'd consider that an immoral gain. Um, does that make sense? Hello.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Um, So there's low trust versus high trust ethics there, and natural law. If you look at the whole checklist, it goes into a lot more detail than just saying voluntary, voluntary. And so a lot of libertarians are really great people, but once again, there's a lot of things they take for granted. So another libertarian I spoke to said, oh well, if you're trying to blackmail people, it's coercion. It's like, well, they say, well, that's not voluntary because of coercion. Other libertarians say it is. So there's a difference there. And the difference really comes down to, are you fully accounting for preserving the incentive for cooperation? Or are you trying to get like a short term, quote, voluntary interaction to your benefit without thinking about its external effects? Um, the next one is in the definition of property, and this is the slide I had to get. So libertarians consider what they call intersubjectively verifiable property, which means stuff. So intersubjectively means between us, we can subjectively verify stuff. So things we can all see exist. Cars, but now they do acknowledge things like reputation and a few things like that. But in natural law, we use the term property in toto, which means property in totality. So what we do, there's a couple of slides here I'll give to John. It would be good to put up. Um, anything that humans will demonstrate an interest in, invest in, and defend is what we define as property.
And just to clarify, physical items, so like a house, a country, a city, or does that also relate to intangible things like beliefs, friendships, those kind of?
Yeah, so I'll go through it, but that's the difference between libertarianism and natural law is that
Okay.
we say that property in toto, so total property, is anything that humans will demonstrate an interest in, invest, which just means just investing in, and defend. So we have the first category, existential interests, yourself, which is your life, body, genes, memory, mind, attention, time, and action. So when they say, oh, we value freedom, what you're saying is we value the ability to take action to pursue returns, to pursue opportunities. Um, Second, opportunity for action, stimulation, experience, what we call freedom. Imitations, skills, knowledge, techniques, procedures. Four, self image, status, class, which come down to mindfulness, reputation, and honor. Five, kith, kin, and mates. So even your access to mates. Six, sustainable patterns of association, cooperation, insurance, reproduction, production, distribution, and trade, etc., etc. So that's your existential interests. Two, second category, obtained interests. These where interest refers to interests that are obtained by bearing a cost of opportunity, time, effort, resources to obtain the interest without imposing upon previously borne costs of others. So, several personal interests, personal property, that's what libertarians usually talk about. And this is where we differ from libertarians. Shareholder or fractional interest, shares in property, title interests, weights and measures, artificial interests or privileges. And the third one is commons. sorry, actually, this is more where we deviate from libertarians. What people will common interests that people will call property, genetic capital, human capital, informational commons, informal institutions, formal commons, which is physical capital, monuments, arts and artifacts, and common opportunity interests. So there's a lot more detail there than what libertarians usually consider, but these are the things that we've tried to objectively define, because what we're trying to do is be very empirical about what humans value and what they're going to value as a form of property. So genetic capital. If your immigration policy is lowering the average IQ of your society, then what you're doing is trespassing against a form of common property. Human capital, which is a combination of indoctrination, education, and training in our population. So if you were interfering with the processes that train people into what they need to be, you're interfering with a form of common property. Informational commons, which is knowledge and information. If you're trying to interfere with the the way that people get knowledge and information in your society that they need to survive and thrive, you're interfering with a common property. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Informal institutions, norms, habits, manners, ethics, and morals. Formal institutions, blah, blah, blah. So we go through the whole list. There's a lot of different things there that under natural law, we say this is more empirically what human beings will consider a form of property, will consider their demonstrated interest. And if you violate those things, you're creating in them an incentive to retaliate or break cooperation. So, I mean, that probably answers one of your immigration questions.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add to that or ask about that?
No, I think just to cover up for the audience at home, one of our paid subscribers put in a question for us to ask Rob, and that was around natural law's approach to immigration. And I think I'd like to expand it slightly. We saw when we had Mr. Ruddock on last week, he was talking about an approach where you get rid of the current system and then you implement a system where a firm or an individual who wants to employ an immigrant would have to pay $80,000 to the government, put that person in, and they work, and kind of buying into the system. Firstly, I want you to evaluate that system from a natural law perspective, and secondly, tell me what a immigration system for Australia under that would abide by natural law would look like.
Well, I mean, hopefully, this chat is the beginning of your listeners being able to get an idea for themselves. So we've got the test for reciprocity, which it gave you, which is voluntary, warranted, productive, exhaustively informed, and free of externalities. So that's the test for whether you're cooperatively trading property. And we've just gone through a pretty extensive
Mm.
list of different properties as well. So a lot of these things, in the third category, common interest. I mean, that's one of the big differences between libertarians is the degree to which they acknowledge commons. Um, so I think that if you had a moral government, a lot of these things would be decided by the people. I mean, my opinion on immigration is that if the people have said they've had enough, then they've had enough. That it's really that simple. If people feel like, so when we look about informational commons or informal institutions, norms, habits, manners, ethics, and morals, if we're getting people in here that don't abide by our habits, manners, ethics, and morals, then you're interfering with a form of common property. And the common property is important because that's how people understand the rules of high trust commons by which we increase our capture of energy, by which we cooperate. So there's a video I'd like John to cut in. I'll give it to him. So hopefully by the time I say this, it's on the screen. And I ran this poll on Twitter, or X now, and said, how do you feel about this? So the video is a woman in public being filmed miming lewd acts in a shopping center somewhere. She's basically miming sex acts in front of the public and in front of kids. Now, I asked on X, do you consider this person a free individual exercising her right to self ownership, or do you see her as imposing a cost on the demonstrated interests of others and therefore deserving of some legal stopping mechanism? And it was actually about 50-50. So if you're going to look at natural law, if you're going to look at the entire spectrum of property that we describe, where you look at commons or informational capital, human capital. So another form of capital, I guess it would come under informational institutions, is preserving our children's innocence for an age appropriate level. And so if you're walking past with your 5-year-old and you see this woman miming sex acts in public, which she's doing to film to cause a controversy to then sell her OnlyFans, you're violating a form of property, a form of common property. And that common property exists to not to restrict interruptions in the natural maturation of children and their agency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. I think that's rather intuitive as well, because you talk to any sane Australian or any normal person, and they would understand this, as a normal thing. You don't want children being exposed to these kinds of public behaviors.
Exactly, but that's what I said at the start. A lot of this stuff is very intuitive, but we've fleshed it out into a very detailed system of measurement so that it, one day maybe could be encoded as a legal system. Because if you want to put things in law, it's got to be exact. Do you know what I mean? It's got to be more than intuitive.
Yeah,
But the intuition is still there, and that's what I said. A lot of people are going to feel like what I say makes sense, but they might not have the language. And so, what I would say from a natural law perspective is my children's age appropriate um, attention and awareness of things is a demonstrated interest. Because what happens is if you sexualize children too early, they engage in practices beyond their ability to safely incorporate them, and they run the risk of damaging their ability to pair bond later, which, we see in modern hookup culture. People have bad relationships because basically a lot of people have just so damage their ability to actually stay pair bonded for life. And that damages their ability to have stable nuclear families and thus reproduce a society or your genetic capital. So, what that woman is doing, and hopefully this video is on the screen now, is she is profiting at the expense of everyone else's demonstrated interest. Does that make sense?
yeah. And from our current system in the country, we kind of do have a libertarian view where that woman making a profit that has a tangible benefit. She gets a paycheck, she pays taxes, where the child's innocent doesn't have a value. Like that's a shadow price, which currently, some people like you and I would put a high value on that, others wouldn't. So it does, you know, give credence to the idea that these kind of there needs to be a codified code or something of the sort to kind of instill a regimented system to prevent things like this from happening. Because we've had a breakdown in society where things like this can happen, and people don't feel like they can go to people in public and say you shouldn't be doing this in front of children.
Yes, we've had it. Well, I mean, the Marxists said they were going to march through the institutions. They've marched through our institutions of cultural production. So a lot of these commons, people don't have the language. I mean, and that's what this work does. I mean, it was originally called proprietarianism because it reframes everything as a form of property because the law can deal with property. The law can deal with property rights violations. Um, so there's also, yeah, I mean, people are going to feel like it's intuitive, but we're giving a language to saying, no, what you're doing here is you are profiting at the expense of my demonstrated interest, which is my child's age appropriate awareness. And I mean, there's even things in there like we think about all these different forms of property. And right back in the existential interest, we talk about attention and time. You know, a lot of these smaller things would be democratically, you would think ideally would be democratically decided at local levels. But, there's even a case to be made for interruption advertising. Because if you say, well, my attention and my time is another form of existential property, is another form of demonstrated interest, what right do you have to profit by forcing yourself into my field of attention? And so, the ultimate answer that we say, and we do share with the libertarians, is that, voluntary sortation is a good idea. And so that's why, this work is a bit of a continuation of the American project, where the whole idea of America is you've got a few things that have to be federally cooperated with, national defense and that sort of thing. But a lot of this commons production is up to the states. And so, but you might even have a commons that says, well, no, we don't want interruption advertising here because people don't want it. Why do you get to profit by having these clown pop-ups on the street? And, when people are having a nice day and then you're getting a Lowe's ad in your face or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
A lot of these things might be at the level where people don't care, and that's fine. They're not demonstrating an interest. But if people demonstrate an interest in something, then it becomes a form of property. And if you want to preserve cooperation, you have to be empirical about what they consider their demonstrated interests. Does that make sense?
So it's
So
kind of you don't put a billboard up in front of a beautiful sunset because people value that sunset,
if the people in
which is
that
a real
society, if people, so,
yeah,
once again, if you had a government that's trying its best to maximize the gold standard of cooperation, which is reciprocity, you might say, well, we're going to have, a council vote on this. In Australia, it might be like a town or something, or, you might have a local council that says, well, this is what we do and what we don't do. So we are a lot more, like you said, libertarian um, than natural law might suggest some people want. But yeah, exactly. If other people want beautiful buildings, if they don't like communist what do they call that? Brutalism. That
yeah.
they want a beautiful commons because they're saying, well, that's, we value how it makes us feel and that's going to make us more happy and productive and blah, blah, blah. Then these are all demonstrated interests. So that's why we use the term demonstrated interest. But if people don't care, then they're not demonstrating an interest and it's not property. So, but
Just
once again, yeah.
just to follow up on that, what happens if there is a demonstrated interest between two groups which opposes each other? So one person wants something, or one group of people want a certain thing, and then the other group wants an opposite of that one thing. Is there a way to deal with that?
It really depends on what it is. So another thing, like I did a commons chat because commons is really one of the big areas where we diverge from libertarianism. And I'm just editing a commons chat I had with the founder, Kurt Doolittle. If it depends what you're talking about, and it depends on how much people value or don't value it. So the one of the really obvious examples he used was an aqueduct, and he said, um, people have been building aqueducts for a long time, and everybody makes use of the aqueduct. And if you're not making use of the aqueduct, it means you're defecating in the street, and we don't want you to do that. So we're going to force you to pay for some of the aqueduct. Do you know what I mean? That's a common property that everybody
Yeah.
wants. And so the reciprocity is if you're benefiting from something, it's not theft or the initiation of force to make you pay for something that you're benefiting. It's suppression of free riding. And that's a big difference once again with libertarians that say, oh, taxation is theft, government's coercion. It's like, well, are they coercing you or are they suppressing free riding? And so another thing too that we say is that
And
markets, sorry?
I was going to say, and that's important because in economics, you talk about the tragedy of the commons, where there's things that have a public benefit often fail to get money privately. So you have to kind of have this, what a libertarian would call a coercion or force from the government to actually fund things like an aqueduct or public parks of the like.
Absolutely. And so, like I said in this chat, once again, you guys could post it. And if your listeners want to follow me on Twitter, once this Commons chat is published, you'll be able to read through it. It'll go on the Natural Law Substack. Gives you some good food for thought. But you can't. I mean, at the extremes is the people want to pay for a commons, and if you don't want to pay for it, then we don't want you here. That's reciprocity, because people need the ability to voluntarily disassociate. But it really depends on what it is. So once again, the idea of the aqueduct: if we don't want you defecating in the street, and if you're going to do that, we don't want you here. Therefore, everybody's benefiting from that. Therefore, you can pay for it. Therefore, us expecting you to pay for it is not coercion, it is suppression of free riding. Another example I always use is that markets, as libertarians, all about markets, and markets do create wealth. That is true, but markets rely on high trust and the rule of law. Because if you don't have the rule of law, you don't have markets, or you don't have efficient markets anyway. And high trust lowers the price of cooperation. And so if you do something that violates high trust, like we're talking about with the girl in public, if you're trying to make a profit by consuming a form of common property. Do you know what I mean? So if your action violates high trust, if you're trying to profit by doing something that violates high trust, you are profiting privately, but raising the costs on everybody else. And so that's another thing where the immigration thing comes in too, is if you want to bring in people that don't assimilate into your society, and we use the term reciprocity in display, word, and deed. So reciprocity in display, word, and deed, because it is empirically true of human beings that if you wear an offensive display down the street, say from a completely different country or a hostile religion or something like that, that's going to be damaging to social trust. Therefore, with John's example, if you want to bring in workers, but they fail the test of reciprocity in display, word, and deed, because then what you're doing is you're profiting as a business owner at the expense of making cooperation more expensive for everybody else, i.e., that's what we say, you're privatizing the commons. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think with a lot of these things, it's going to depend on which commons you're talking about. If you once again, if in an ideal world, if you have a park or something, you could very easily say, well, we want to fund these parks, and if you don't pay for it, you can't go in the park. That's not very hard. But the other thing to remember too is libertarians always talking about private roads. So what people do when they're very ideological is they look at the benefit, but they don't look at the costs. And so they say, well, if you had private roads, then people are going to, you might get more competition. I don't even know if that's necessarily true, because private interests run for profit, but then again, we hire contractors who work for profit. So I don't know exactly. I can't really model which would be more expensive or not. I'm not sure. But you made a good point too, which Kurt also said, that, back in the day, in medieval Europe or whatever, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was a bigger disparity between the average person, the wealth of the average person, and the aristocracy. So a lot of these commons could be funded by the aristocracy, and the royals. But now we don't have people with that kind of private wealth so readily available. So a lot of these things, if they're going to be funded at all, need to be funded by the commons, by the people in a common interest. That's the only way they're even going to exist. So that's another avenue to look at as well. But what I'll say too the libertarians, and this is a blind spot for libertarians, is if you want all these different companies to be owning all these different roads, if you're just looking at the economics and you make an economic prediction that the competition will get the prices down, that's fine. But look at this list of demonstrated interests that we've just gone through, and you'll see things like memories, mind, attention, time, and action. And so, what I've always said with libertarians is if it gets too annoying to be dealing with different road companies, people are not going to do it.
Mm.
If it takes too much of their cognitive resources or their time and their attention, and once again, libertarians tend to be pretty intellectual and smart people, so they might have a larger capacity for paperwork and bureaucracy and different insurance companies than the average person. I think the average person now is overburdened by paperwork and bureaucracy as it is. I don't think people want to be worrying about which company owns which roads. It's simply going to pose too much of a cost on their time, their attention, and their mental burden. And so they're not going to go for it. And so if you might get a couple, like if you want to drive to Melbourne and then, it doesn't really matter. It's going to take you 2 days either way and you can choose one private highway. But so even though I'm very skeptical that things like that are ever going to happen and that they could happen without violating so much of other people's demonstrated interests. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
I fully agree with that. Especially like you talk about roads, that's a key thing. And there's an idea of natural monopolies where you've got things like major highways or energy transmission infrastructure where the market can't sustain competition because you can't have like two power systems running simultaneously. You have to have one central one, or you can't
yeah,
have four different highways to Melbourne because it won't get used. And I think
yeah,
that's one of the biggest blind spots, definitely for libertarians, is whilst there is a demonstrated benefit for market competition in some goods, it's not for all goods. And as you were talking about with the example of multiple highways to Melbourne, that would violate the commons. You'd have to knock down parks to put a different highway in, or you have to get rid of people's houses and destroy pristine environments. And there is a cost with that that doesn't get factored into the calculation for libertarians.
absolutely. But in natural law, we do account for those costs as thoroughly as we possibly can. And so, once again, I urge people to look through the tiles that are hopefully on the screen, or you can get them off me on Twitter as well. We look at all the costs, and that's what I say. Like people, when they are ideological, they go, "Look at this great benefit." And this is funny because it's actually a libertarian, like economic. It's an economic principle which libertarians should be aware of, but they don't look at the benefits. But it's just that the externalities they look at are economic
Mm.
externalities. We're looking at complete existential, obtained, and common externalities. That's the spectrum of property that we're
Yeah,
talking about. And I think it's a much more empirical way of looking at human nature. And what's his name? The guy that just Senator Rennick, Gerard Rennick. He made the same point in a discussion with John Ruddock as well, that a lot of these things like docks, power stations, a lot of this infrastructure, they are natural monopolies because it's
yeah,
absurd waste to have more than one of them running. And so probably the most reciprocity you're going to get is that these monopolies are accountable to a democratic government where the people can have some kind of say over it, ideally. I'm not saying we're there at the moment. And I definitely don't want to, I'm not defending the way things are because the government is extractive. And so, so voluntism versus reciprocity, intersubjectively verifiable versus property in toto, individualism versus high trust. And so, once again, in the same way that some things that libertarians will phrase, like using an aqueduct or a certain infrastructure that you can't get away from benefiting from, or something, or commons, they will phrase it as, "Oh, that taxation is theft and you're initiating coercion against me." It's like, no, we're not. You're benefiting from this by definition. So we're suppressing free riding. And in the same way, runaway individualism without respect to, say, the informational commons, the human capital, the informational institutions, that erodes social trust, which raises the cost of cooperation. So it undermines markets anyway. So we try to take that into factor as well. And once again, the best example I found with this was the video of the lady, you know, consuming the high trust commons by making a profit of advertising her OnlyFans in public. Any questions with any of that? It's all pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. I think we'll move on to the next topic, which was
Cool. So
energy consumption fee capitalizing.
yeah. So once again, we talk about natural law. I mean, you're in economics. You know the idea of the division of labor.
Yeah,
Scientifically, we can talk about it as capture of energy. It's returns on energy. Um, the problem with where we are now, which is correct, the libertarians do have a correct intuition about this, is that we basically have a government that has been captured, government and institutions that has been captured by the left, and they are consuming so much wealth. It's just a consumption. So if you consume energy without creating returns on it, that's a consumption. So once again, if in the lady that's profiting from degrading high trust commons, she's just consuming the commons. If you are throwing money into ideological things and not getting returns on them, you're just consuming. But what's going on now is that the left, and I've said this on the last podcast, the left is generally the political manifestation of the feminine, and the feminine, you've got a lot of more feminine women and feminine men. They run a lot on empathy, and so they're like, oh, we need to fund this and we need to fund that and empathetic this and empathetic that and this person's need and
true.
vulnerable groups, blah, 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 blah. But the difference is when you do that in a family, we call that forbearance. They're your forebears. You are investing in your own children. But what the left has done is put these sort of feminine, empathetic, family-based, and that's what communism is the correct system for a family, but you're getting those virtues and trying to make them at political scale, and it doesn't work. And so what we're getting is this huge consumption of wealth. We're not getting returns on it. The left basically says, "Give me money. I'm going to throw it at this black hole cause, and I'm going to feel good about myself." Because then they get to consume fake virtue signals as well. So libertarians are actually correct. We are in an extractive environment right now, but that doesn't mean that every commons is consumptive. And so once again, we talk about things like high trust, the aqueducts, some infrastructure, like you said. I mean, if you really want to talk about commons, it depends which commons you're talking about, and then we can go through the thing and deconstruct it and think about what maximum reciprocity is. But some of them are going to be capitalizing as well. You're going to get better returns on the costs of those things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the commons are going to be energy multipliers. They can be, and some of them are. But the problem with libertarians is they don't define what is a consumption and what is a capitalizing commons, which are a consumption of resources and ones you're going to get returns on. They just say, well, don't have any. They're saying, well, we don't have a system to decide which are reciprocal and capitalizing versus which are irreciprocal and consumptive. So then get rid of them, and then run with this basically like this abstract moral that will, initiation of force, blah blah blah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does.
Cool. And the last one I want to touch on too is once again we try to be very empirical about human nature, and we're just like reality bots. It's like, what's the truth here? What's the absolute, good and bad truth of human nature in the world and how we operate in it? Libertarians say, well, taxation is theft. So what you're doing is saying That's a moral abstract. And what do you do with that? It's like saying, well, you should do this because my religion says so. But all people have to do is say, well, I've got a different religion. and what do you do then? Like I said in a original chat on the other side, said, most people's morals are emotional codifications of their incentives. Does that make sense? They're like in a way to feel and identify emotionally with your incentives. But other
Yeah.
people have different incentives, so they create different moral systems. And so that's one of the problems too with libertarianism. Okay, how do you actually get to the point of creating a common interest of private property in the way that you want to? Well, we look at the history of the West versus other civilizations, and the West started out as cattle raiders and Vikings. And what they did there was said, well, we are a loose sort of cooperative group of different tribes, but they have mutual defense pacts. So they'd have agreements for mutual insurance, which means you do you, I do me. So we are sovereign within our tribe or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you get attacked, we all have an agreement to come to each other's defense. And that's actually the way you construct rights. And so that's why, years ago we say, if you can defend a thing, you can be said to own a thing. So what this is if we talk about demonstrated interest, if you had a moral government, they would be looking at reciprocity between demonstrated interests. But when you go outside your group, it's human nature for them to possibly look at your stuff and want to take it. So how do you defend yourself against other groups that aren't moral? Well, you have to have mutual insurance on the use of force. And force, like fire, it's where libertarians say, "Oh, it's morally wrong. It's morally wrong. It's morally wrong." Well, it's just a resource. It can be used for good or bad ends. Are you following me with that?
Yeah.
So that is also what a nation and a government is. It is the use of force to enforce mutual insurance of whatever rights that the people decide they want to have. And so it's another thing there when you're trying to get people. Libertarians say a lot of different things about this, but we say that rights are constructed by reciprocal insurance, which means if we all agree on this and we agree to defend it, then you can be said to have a right. Whereas you can't. It's like ineffectual or like a weak strategy to say, well, you should do this because it's correct, It's more like a leftist. You're just sort of moralizing at people, hoping they do what you want them to do. But it's not really empirical with human nature. And so there is some sense, I think, in which, if everybody, might have their own Mick Nukes in their own Mick backyard and they're all individuals, you might be undermining that collective defense. And so we've said that there's probably a good reason a libertarian nation doesn't really exist, if you know what I mean. It's
Yeah.
probably gets outcompeted by nations that actually do enforce some collective defense and that sort of thing.
Even in that defense scenario you present, there is like an economies of scale where
Absolutely.
the col- where the collective defense output of individuals all doing their own thing is going to be less than one centralized government doing it, because there would be efficiencies in not only cost of production but also organizing everything in terms of
Absolutely.
manpower, resources, everything like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like that economy of scale is going to apply to a lot of commons and stuff as well. But
Yeah.
interesting when I spoke to Ruddick and his I think his assistant, his manager or something. Anyway, because they're all ANCAP, And I said, well, people can voluntarily boot people out of or disassociate with people. I said, oh, we think it's fine for that to happen in like a small community where you have, like a gated community, you have a body corporate, and this is the rules of the bylaws, the blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, but that's just what a state is at a larger scale. And the reason it would be larger scale, and probably the reason we've settled on the scales that we have, like you said, when it comes to national defense, there are economies of scale. So there's that there's the pressure you just described in expanding, but then there's maybe it's going to trample on the freedom, to a degree. But once again, it's all about equilibrium, if you know what I mean. So economies of scale with defense is going to be an expansive pressure on the size of a government that we have to settle on. You know what I mean? And so once again, the American setup where you say we have these states that are negotiating more local things like, do we allow abortion, do we want to fund it, do we want a billboard in front of the sunset, all these sort of things. That's probably what we say is the ideal scenario, but you solve the economies of scale in national defense by having a very limited federal operation as well. I mean, it's actually a testament to how good that system is. And a lot of the guys say that what the natural law project is doing is it's building on that. It's building on the Lockean natural law. A lot of the Anglo stuff, the British stuff, British systems of government, then the American experiment. It's and I think Kurt, the founder, actually had a presentation from 2023 said patching the holes in the American Constitution because I think it was 8 or 10. He said there's 8 or 10 holes that the Marxists and the left have really leveraged. But apart from that, it's actually a pretty good system, and there are good reasons why.
I think it's quite a self-evident that the American system, by and large, is a good system because we've seen in the last 250 years almost, it's gone from not even a regional power to the undisputed, still global power, and they've been able to exert more influence and more control than any other empire in history.
Mm. I'm not saying they should do that because,
Neither do I, but
yeah, yeah. But that's right. The resources and the efficiency of the system creates the capacity to do that. Um, I think morally myself, even if people can't offer you a benefit, I still think it's wrong to invade them. And the British thought this too. I mean, that's why the British and so many the people that colonized different areas they bought or they traded something of value for land. They tried to make trades because it's like, well, we're trying to get some reciprocal trade thing happening here. They didn't just bulldoze people, despite what the left is trying to say these days. They
yeah,
didn't do that. You've gone through that on your show so many times. They said, okay, well, we want this piece of land. Can we trade you some horses or something for it? And, we might look at the value of the land now and say that's a bad trade. But at the time, what reciprocal value did the natives put on that land? Well, not much because they didn't do anything with it. You know what I mean? Um, so,
exactly.
yeah, I mean, going through natural law too, when I was a libertarian about 10 years ago, I used to look at the government and think it's so corrupt, it's so corrupt. And look, there is a lot of corruption, but going through natural law, I'm like, oh, there's actually pretty good reasons why things are the way they are, and it's actually in a lot of ways the best it's ever going to be given human nature. And that's another point we say is the left goes, well, we wish people were like this, and the libertarians go, well, we wish people were like this. Well, natural law, we say, what, I wish I had a gold toilet. I wish I could fly. It doesn't matter. We're dealing with human beings, and this seems to be their nature to the best that we can discern. And this is the best we're going to get. And like personally, I think the left and their funding is absolutely catastrophic. Like I'm talking about the wealth redistribution, the funding
Hmm.
ideological
Yep.
causes, the funding welfare. I think for me that drastically violates reciprocity. But you have to look at people's demonstrated interest. Despite what I say, what do I do? I'm still here. I can still make money. I can still have a good life. I'm really not happy about the amount of tax I pay. So it's not it's not the gold standard of cooperation for me, but has it tipped? We think about reciprocity. It's not like an on-off switch. It's like supply demand curves. As the as the cost of cooperation gets high, the incentive to break it goes up. Do you know what I mean? And so that's what's going on with people generally. Now, interestingly, um, during COVID, my business was shut down. I ran for politics under Clive, and I put a lot of time and energy into that because the incentives changed, and I went hell for leather. But then, business is back on, things are back to normal. I'm not happy with what they do, but I still have a good life. So my incentive, my reciprocity supply and demand curve lands me here. And I am getting kind of sick of this country. And so I do things like this to try and fight for it to be better. But the left is so what they are that if they got much worse, I would seriously consider moving overseas or getting more radical again. And well, I mean, I think everybody's getting more radical because once again, the incentives are changing. But do you know what I mean, though? That the left are doing the wrong thing. And I think the best thing we can say is that they're just consumptive. They're like hyper consuming civilizational capital.
Yeah.
But,
And I think that's
but
pretty clear to see to everyone. It's not just in Australia; it's in America, it's in Europe.
yes,
It's this collective. I can't really describe where it comes from, but it's kind of this. Some people I've heard it being described as this bio-Leninist approach where you take what would have previously been lower classes of people and you elevate them up to the top. And previously, these people wouldn't have contributed too much value to society. They would have been, the beggars on the streets, and now they're the ones, in charge of government, in charge of departments, in charge of states, and they're the ones who decide to change the incentives, change tax policy, and
absolutely.
and to their own benefit at the expense of the people or the commons.
Absolutely. So, we make no qualms. We agree with the libertarians. The left is out of control. And once again, it demonstrated genetic capital, human capital, knowledge capital, normative capital, institutional capital, physical capital, cultural capital, and opportunity capital. They're all the common interests. Um, the left is consuming all of them. They're just consuming all of them because they are. It's like, are you talking about the normal leftist that believes it, or the Machiavellian leftist that's in the background, kind of profiting off it?
I'm
Um,
talking about the Machiavellian, yeah.
yeah, they're just profiting off the destruction of civilization.
Yeah.
That's all they're doing. So we agree with the libertarians in that way. I can't remember what I was going to say actually, but I think the point is that it doesn't mean um, all forms of common property are not are consumptive. Some of them are capitalizing as well,
Yeah.
and that's really one of the big differences with libertarianism. I think that's about it. Um, I think that's been a pretty good overview. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's been excellent. I just have one question I just thought of. So you're
Hmm.
talking about how the left's kind of come up and they're kind of consuming rather than generating into the system. Do you think obviously Trump wins the election yesterday our time? Do you think his resounding victory over the left will change the kind of political system, or is it more the same? The status quo continues.
I'm really willing to give him one more chance. I mean, not that I have the, who cares what I think, but just for my own personal emotional state, I'm happy to put my faith in him again and say, okay, you didn't know what you're up against last time. I think the team he's got around him is really killer. Like just with RFK and Elon talking about government efficiency and all that sort of stuff, like
Yeah,
I'm pretty excited about it. And I think that one of the main tips of the left is to demoralize people. What they do, and once again, because they're feminine, is, and if you look at masculine antisocial behavior is often physical. It's just the use of violence, and it's really bad. Not excusing it, but feminine antisocial behavior is more psychological. So what they
yeah,
tend to do is want to sort of demoralize you psychologically, so you don't have a defense against what they're doing, and that's the left institutionalizes that. So what I really see Trump, and that's why people don't care that he's a bit of a jock and he's a bit rough around the edges, is it's like, I'm not going to be demoralized. So I'm going to be moralized. Things are going to be awesome. And I think that's going to have a huge flow on effect with the culture. It's going to remoralize people. And I really hope it emboldens people down here as well. I think it is. I think it's a turning point culturally where we say, no, we've had enough of this demoralization and your psychological abuse. So I'm happy
Yeah,
about it. I'm
I
actually
think
really happy about it.
yeah, I think so. But I think the problem is we've got to ensure that, you know, his term's only going to last 4 years, and we've got to try and ensure that there isn't like what happened last time when he got voted out. It flipped right back suddenly. So we need to try and make whatever change Trump is culturally, try and establish that long term rather than just the man's
Yep.
gone. And then it got worse after Trump. So that's my biggest concern.
Yeah, that's true. Another Natural Law Institute fellow, Brandon Hayes, recently posted, and he said the law is a malleable tool. It evolves depending on what people demand of it. So if we want the law to reflect our demonstrated interest, you've got to demonstrate an interest. That's what I've always said in the first one with John too, and I'm saying it all the time. You need to demonstrate interest. So if you're listening to this, you need to speak, meet up, act, do something, share, whatever it is you can to start pushing in the right direction. Because once again, I do natural law and it's not always nice. It's the law of the jungle. It's the law of nature. You don't want to be like the species that died off because you didn't fight, because that's really what it comes down to. And once again, there's natural laws like entropy, and that's what we said right at the start. Entropy is the continual escape of energy from a system over time. It's always there. It doesn't go away. It's a continual process that we need to stay ahead of. And sometimes other people, the left, is the manifestation of entropy in human form because they're just so hyper consumptive. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's never going away. There is no steady state where you just wish that, okay, well, I'm just going to say private property and non-aggression principle that people are going to leave me alone. It doesn't really work like that. You need to mutually insure yourself with other like-minded people, because once again, the natural law says at the end of the day, if you can defend a thing, you can be said to own a thing.
I think that's an excellent way to sum up this whole discussion. And one way you can
Great.
support us is obviously finding us on Substack. Search thenationalobserver.co. Subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Become a paid subscriber if you're rich. And then obviously you can go and support Rob on X or Twitter at the McMullen, or you can find his work at the Natural Law Institute. We'll put all the links in the description. Thanks for coming on, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll just say, what I hope with this is that there's some language, there's some ideas, there's um, some concepts that give shape to what you might feel. But maybe I've given you some ideas, a way to talk about it. And if you want to pursue that further, then yeah, ask me some questions. Follow me on Twitter and look at some of the natural law presentations that we've got. The guy's really fleshing this stuff out. Um, and so I think if you are following the libertarians because you're against the left, but you feel like there's some things you really don't agree with, maybe the commons or the runaway individualism, that sort of thing, get involved, ask questions, because I think we do have a lot of answers along that vein that are quite beneficial.
Thanks, Rob, and have a good week, everyone. Bye bye.